Thank you, Dr. Anand, Dr. James, Mr. Jha, and to all of you, thank you for inviting me to join you this morning. So I'm going to do three things. One, I'll address what Mr. Jha asked me to do. But what I'd like to do is put the entire discourse on these indicators into some context. So when you interrogate them and you come up with you can do that, with some awareness of the context in which we are developing these. So what is a VNR? I've spent 15 years in the UN system, so and I must confess to you that something very I don't know whether to tell you. I was one of the people who invented is, I'm using that word advisedly, the MDG indicators. We did it in a closed room, not like this. So I've learned something from that. The process of developing indicators for the SDGs has fundamentally three objectives in a multilateral system. First objective is the objective of the UN bureaucracy. Because remember, this is the time when you will ideate. After this will become a bureaucratic process. This is not a public process. As you were saying, you will come for 3 minutes and all that, but massive UN bureaucracy, massive Indian bureaucracy, massive Brazilian bureaucracy, the conversation will be amongst them, not even the political leaders, beyond the point. It's a bureaucratic conversation. So what these indicators do is allow bureaucrats to have a conversation amongst themselves using metrics that are not politically controversial. Okay? And of course, a sidelight of that is that I can take every indicator here and tell you which UN agency's jobs depends on it. So there is that process, and we can't change it, we have to be conscious of it. The second reason why we have indicators is which is something I think Dr. Anand rightly pointed out, is to allow multilateral agencies and those who are interested in doing it, including some international NGOs, to compare and contrast countries. There is no point in stating the obvious here, that unless you disagree with me. If you think that someone below the poverty line in Africa and someone below the poverty line in India, or more aptly someone above the poverty line in Sweden and someone above the poverty line in India are comparable, then you should be happy with these international comparisons. There is an international comparisons project that has been going on for most of my life. It's housed in the UN, it has the World Bank input, it's still not complete. For the simple reason that human beings are diverse. And the third important reason is that the notion of a nation state, when you're talking about human beings, is fundamentally not suited to international comparison. When I used to say in the UN that the Central African Republic, if you know where that is, will always need aid, because it's an unsustainable nation state. This nation state is still being imagined in ways you may or may not like, but it is changing all the time. So comparing across these nation state constructs in the long term is not going to work. Nevertheless, it happens because human beings psychologically love rankings. Our Prime Minister goes on talking about doing business index. Why? I can tell you 45 things that are wrong with the doing business index. But that is how you conduct international policy negotiations. So the third thing with these indicators, and this is the place I want to focus, is that these indicators are not meant at all, in view of what I have said, you may disagree with me, to judge the progress of Indian development. You can do that within our country with the same data that we may use to construct these indicators, because after all, that data that we use to construct these indicators will be different. But the indicators are going to be used by us for international negotiation, fundamentally. Now, let me move from that to the second point. Where are we on global sustainable development? My view, which I think is shared in large measure by at least most people in the government, not by at least half of civil society, and not by 40% of academia. So here I'm for a change, not for a change.
Not 40% by?
And not by 40% of academia is this. I'm not talking about per capita income and all that. That is a given. We are a developing country, and we are engaged in completing our development transformation, probably 20 years after I die. So assuming I die at the age of 80, that would make it 2060. We should have, we will need steady state. What do I mean steady state? Where people are employed, capital is fully employed, and people have the means to go and buy stuff in the private sector, in the majority, without handouts. Now, if you have special circumstances, then you don't. So typically you are employed and not unemployed. Typically, you're fully employed, not underemployed. Right? Those are the hallmarks of a development process. After that, there is us and about China has completed that, more or less. It completed in 10 years. Because basically, India is one big country, our South Asian neighbors, couple of countries in Southeast Asia, Cambodia, Laos, most of Africa, a few countries in Central America, have to complete their development transformation. But for the first time in human history, we are expected to complete our development transformation without significant incremental consumption of fossil fuels. It's a huge challenge. Without. China has done it. Now they are moving away from coal. Right? So here there is a political conversation to be had on progress on sustainable development, where I think we need, this is where the SDGs is important, because the SDGs are ideated on the basis that there are 3 dimensions to everything that we do. There is the economic dimension, which is growth. There is the social dimension, and their growth is not enough, so we need to look at inclusion. And inclusion is, I'll come to that in a minute. And then, of course, there is the sustainability dimension. But all these are fraught, because at different moments in history, we have different opportunities to address this. And in India's case, it is particularly fraught because now, having destroyed the planet, countries want to rebuild it, even when we want to do things that may, if we went about it the way they did, would cause destruction. And this is something we have to resist. So this is where people begin to depart from me. So I'm not talking about per capita emissions. I'm fine. You want to curb them. But when I use incremental energy and when I make an attempt to use 150 gigabytes of renewables at least, that is still not going to be enough to put a light bulb in every house for every child in India to read. And that is not the Norwegian problem. So what the West is telling you, and this is an important thing for indicators, is we will change the way we consume, but we will not reduce consumption. So we will consume using, wind energy, but we'll keep our houses, I'm going to sit like this in -20, as a country. But that is not why I want energy. I want energy for what is called lifeline consumption. So my consumption is going to increase when my growth increases, and I will do what I can to limit that consequence on the environment. But there will be a limit to what I can do to limit that consequence. Therefore, I will be using, unless you come up with a very fast nuclear program and you're comfortable with it, I will be using incremental fossil fuels in the future. So when you look at the indicators on sustainability, this is very important. Now, there are in this list of indicators things that are highly normative, and you should ask yourself why we have put them there. For example, if you look at the poverty indicator, it says something that as a public finance person I know is absolutely absurd, but it is politically useful, like Mr. James was saying. Percentage of budget directly spent on poverty alleviation programs. Now here I have a problem, It's a big problem, think about it. We are going to grow, we are saying, at 7-8% a year. If I grow at 7-8% a year, I've written about this, and everybody in the country's income increases by at least 6% a year, 8% growth, so at least 6, 2 below the growth, at least 6. I will not need to do anything about poverty alleviation. Poverty will alleviate in about, by calculation, 16 years. 16 years will get 2-3% below the poverty line that every country has. Okay? So what I'm saying when I say I want to do poverty alleviation is I'm saying that my growth will not deliver that poverty alleviation. Same problem with basic income. You're giving up on inclusive growth. So when we say percentage of budget spent directly on poverty alleviation programs, we have to be very careful that we're not making an admission that our growth will not be inclusive. So this is the kind of constructive, I think, feedback that you could all give us. Each and every one of these indicators we need to, because that's a social comment. So what would you prefer, that we grow at 7%? I have benefited hugely in my lifetime from growth. I'm very lucky. So has Mr. Abhind, so have all of you, I guess, most of you. But many people have not. So what we are saying is that, okay, you are not going to participate in growth, so you won't be in this room. I'll give you a handout. It's called universal basic income, and I feel happy. So that is redistributing after the event. Okay? I noticed that there is no indicator for inequality, and I urge you to keep this in mind. That But urge you to keep this in mind, taking as an act of faith the fact that India is going to grow at 7 to 8%. If we take that as an act of faith, then think, what is the minimum amount of income that a person should get to be able to, without any intervention, drive yourself out of poverty? I used to have this problem all the time in the UN. Every education thing I went to, or health thing I went to, all the UN people would talk about, oh, we must promote government, public hospitals. And I used to ask them, how many of you go to public hospitals? How many of your children go to public school? I went to a government school, I don't know. Nowadays I don't meet anybody who goes to a government school. But everybody who doesn't go to a government school talks about government schools. That is the gap between these political conversations, and okay, so that's the second thematic. So when you look at each indicator, ask yourself that is this indicator genuinely doing what you want. Now there's a whole set of indicators you will find, goal 16, etc., where we have not developed an indicator. I don't know, bureaucrats do this mechanically, right? Not developed. These are not indicators we develop. So indicator on 0.7% GNI going to aid is not our indicator. So we'll have to wait for the global indicators, a whole bunch of them. Maybe Mosty could just tick them, or we could tick them in Niti, and say that approximately about 30 indicators here are not for India to develop, because they require international action. Okay, so that's a big relief, so 30 are out. Final point I want to make, so to conclude on sustainable development, the world will make progress on sustainable development. It is not us who will be the binding constraint to that progress, but we need our development to be sustainable for our own reasons. Therefore, the indicators we have should make sense in our own context. But are not going to be, in my view, should not be, and I will write about it publicly, replacing lifeline energy with one form of consumption or the other. And what we need to fight at the global level is, I continue to say this, okay, you're not worried about per capita contribution to global warming or climate change. I want to know how many degrees you will reduce your heating in winter. Will you bring it down to, now it is, they sit in 18 degrees, right? So will you bring it down to 0 and wear a coat at home? And actually reduce your consumption, which opens a carbon budget for me. So I need my indicators to be able to reflect that. It's a very political thing. Third problem is something that you must consider very carefully, especially when we talk about the financing. I'm very worried about the indicators here, which have been to an extent imposed on us, which says increase the tax GDP ratio. So suppose you want to improve the quality of education. My wife works in education. Apparently so does Dr. Anand. And she's always telling me this. You public finance people are, uncaring and all that. So one day I did a calculation where I showed that you need $1,000 per child in India to deliver meaningfully. That is 9% of GDP when you multiply it across 10 years. And so you have to shut down the defense industry. वो तो करेंगे नहीं आप लोग. तो फिर, but the point is actually more fundamental than that. So whenever we talk about increasing the tax GDP ratio, whenever we talk about spending public money, let me give you some data. 3 minutes and wrap up. I'd love to discuss this. India, that is the governments of India, center plus states. Right? Forget the local authorities. In my view, they're marginalized. So I'm not going to punish them for including them in this. 17% of GDP is collected from you and me and everybody else in terms of tax. Okay. In addition, Government of India now borrows 3.42% of GDP, and the state governments borrow another roughly 3% of GDP. So 17 plus 3 plus 3.2 comes to about 24% of GDP. Okay. And for that we have the state we have. Now this is a question on which we need public debate, which nobody wants to do. Are you happy with the size of the state? 1 out of every 4 rupees being spent by the state, are you happy? Your money, tax plus borrowing. Do you want a bigger state? You want it to be 30? You want it to be smaller? Or you want it to be the same? Think about it. Think about it from this side. If you want a bigger state, then fine. Have a consensus that you want a bigger state. No, I'm not promising any improvements in efficiency. Same state. Same kachchar state. You want a bigger one? Be my guest. But if you don't want a bigger one, if you think 1 out of 4 is about right, 24, 25%, then you know what is going to happen. Then you have just done away with the argument that increasing taxes will improve education spending. Because at 25%, if I increase taxes from 17 to 19, I will reduce debt. Because you have fixed the size of the state at 25. Got it? Raising taxes is not about improving the efficiency of the state. So there are 2 answers here. One is to make the state even bigger with no improvements in efficiency. Why am I not worried about improvement in efficiency? Because improvements in efficiency should always happen. It's like saying good food is good for you. There is no intellectual argument to make about improving efficiency. But if you get it, whether you are 25% state or 15% state or 40% state, you should make it efficient. Obviously, you should try and spend the same amount of money and get better results. So there's no intellectual input I can give you there. But there is an input to indicators that say things like, we will raise the tax GDP ratio. Don't assume automatically, unless we all have a consensus in this country that we are going to increase the size of our state as it is, that tax GDP ratio increase will go to education. Right? So effectively what has happened in these global indicators is that a number of indicators that allow for international comparability, such as proportion of public expenditure on education, have been developed to then push countries into making certain kinds of choices. So we have to be careful that we don't fall in the trap of making those choices mindlessly. So if you believe that the binding constraint to improving health and education in India is less public spending, then we can spend more. But you have still not told me whether I should spend less on something else or spend more on everything. You want to go and reduce the defense budget, then you go and tell all our people, jo Siachen mein, apparently the whole Indian army is sitting in Siachen, ki wo defense budget reduce karo. You will not win the battle. Right? So what else will you cut? So we have to look at these indicators in those terms. Do they actually talk about improving expenditure, switching towards the SDGs, which is what I would prefer? Or are they talking simply about expanding the size of the state, which I would not prefer? So that's the third guidepost. So to conclude, one, ask yourself with each indicator, what is the political economy of this? Is it international comparison? Is it not international comparison? Is there a story that India needs to tell using these indicators where we require international cooperation and international action? Otherwise, why are we interested in SDGs? Our policy, we are only interested because we need to cooperate internationally. So on the poverty thing, it is what? It is, do I actually define a poverty line and demonstrate action by linking that action to spending more money on poverty? Or do I actually say that I will reduce poverty by increasing economic growth and keeping it inclusive? That is one kind of question you need to ask. Second kind of question you need to ask is, what's the political game going on? And you will know better than I. What is the water game? What is the environment game? What is the health game? Where we are losing out because the rules of the game are stacked against us. And those indicators must be looked at in that context. And the third is, look at every indicator and see whether it automatically involves or assumes implicitly increasing the size of the state. And if you're happy with increasing the size of the state from 25% of GDP, 25%, then be my guest and say that this is fine. But if you're not happy with increasing the size of the state, you're uncomfortable with the quality of our governance, and you want that quality to improve, then I would question indicators that simplistically just assign increased taxes to every objective that all of us want. Thank you.